Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and I'm here with Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, who I've been wanting to talk to for a long time. He's done incredible work. Not only was he the first Indigenous lawyer in Manitoba, but he's also done incredible work regarding the TRC. And if I went into everything, it would take me all day. He's got a long resume, but I'm honored to finally meet him and talk with him. Now, Murray, we've got a big problem here in Manitoba, and that is 11,000 children are in CFS care right now, 90% First Nations. There is only 11.5 or 11.1% of the total Manitoba population is First Nations. So there's obviously a target on children's heads these days if you are a First Nations child or a parent. So I was wondering, what do you think about the CFS system with people like Alvin Mackling, the former Attorney General, coming out against it? Derek Nepinak told me that it was basically a way to make children commodities in this province. What's your thought on that?
Well, I'm not exactly sure of the numbers that you quoted, but there's no question that Aboriginal children are overrepresented in the child welfare system and have been for probably 30 years, since the 1960s and 1970s. First study that was ever done into it in Manitoba was the Kimmelman report back in the 1980s, and that identified the problem then, and that's almost 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the government of Manitoba has not found a way to deal adequately with that problem. When we did the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in 1991, we identified it as a problem then, and we made recommendations about what needed to be done. And for a while, the government tried to implement those recommendations, but then they kind of went back to the old way of doing things. At least using Indigenous agencies, they went back to the old practice of doing things. Part of the problem is that the model for child welfare in Manitoba is, and in Canada generally, is the wrong model. Agencies are being paid only when they apprehend children.
Yeah, the quota system.
So there's it's not a quota system. It's a financial incentive to seize children. And so it's not like they have a target every year that they have to achieve. But they're told that they will not be paid to do any preventative work or to do work with the families to help them keep the children from coming into care. They will be financially benefited only if they take the children into care. Mm-hmm. So sometimes they'll take a child into care and promise the family that they'll work with them, but then they don't. Yeah. And so it all becomes a cycle of apprehension and removal from families. And what needs to be done is that whole model needs to change. The way that agencies do their work, they should be financially penalized if they take a child into care, I think, because there's no incentive for them to do otherwise. And I think that the way that agencies are going about their work in terms of decision making is also wrong. You can't train people to be parents. You can't train them to make proper parental decisions. And in particular, corporations are notoriously bad parental agencies. The residential schools have proven that. And so what needs to be done is that decision-making needs to be given back to the family, and families need to be involved in the planning of the care for children. Even if the parents of those children are not able to care for them, the overall extended family can and should be involved in the ultimate decision-making. And if they're not involved, then the community itself should be involved and engaged. And that's not happening right now.
Well, and do you think what's currently happening with the CFS system, do you think that it is kind of like the continuation of the residential schools or the 60s scoop?
Oh, absolutely. In our report for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have pointed to the evidence which shows that in the 1960s, as they began to close down residential schools, they transferred large numbers of children from the care of the residential school authorities into the care of provincial authorities. And so that actually led directly to the 60s scoop, as it came to be known. But more importantly, the schools had already gotten into the practice of not returning children to their homes, and therefore they imposed that same approach, or called for the provincial agencies to utilize that same approach of not returning children to their homes and trying to find a non-indigenous alternative placement. And that practice even goes into the United States. So in the 1960s, the social work profession generally believed that culture and indigenous reality was not important and was irrelevant. And they didn't realize just how wrong that was.
Yeah. Now, one last question, and then I'll let you go. Something that has only started really coming up recently, which is kind of surprising to me, is the Indian Act. Now, there's so much over-the-top political correctness in society when it comes to some things, but then these same people that are over-the-top politically correct completely ignore something where we're looking at legislation that says that First Nations people are somewhat not human almost. And this is such an outdated, ridiculous piece of legislation. What can people do about the Indian Act to, try and get rid of it? I mean, that's the only thing I could think of is just get rid of the Indian Act. I mean, and what can people do to do that, and what would they do afterwards once they're rid of, the Indian Act?
Well, that is the question. Actually, I think just about everybody who looks at the issue of the Indian Act agrees that it's an archaic piece of legislation and needs to be done away with.
Yeah.
But what they can't agree on is what needs to be put in place instead of it. Mm-hmm. First Nations people who are affected by it, and now probably Inuit and Métis people who are also subject to federal jurisdiction, it would appear, are also, I think, going to be concerned about what the federal government is going to want to do. And I think really the answer lies in a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which talks about the fact that legislation like the Indian Act is not needed. What is needed is legislation which defines the federal government's obligation to uphold the treaties, and which holds and defines the federal responsibility, legal responsibility, to carry out its fiduciary obligations where Indigenous people are concerned. But we don't need legislation which defines who's an Indian. We don't need legislation which defines who's a Métis or who's an Inuit. We don't need legislation of that kind, because those aspects of the legislation were really there in order to allow the government to be able to escape from its responsibilities. And we're no longer going to be able to talk about that. So it does require a whole revamping of the view of the relationship between Indigenous people and the government of this state. But it's not about creating and establishing a relationship of imposed power over the way that Indigenous people conduct their lives. But now it has to be a piece of legislation which better defines how the federal government will carry out its share of the responsibility, and let the Indigenous people define for themselves so they will carry out their share of the responsibility.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. I've been wanting to talk to you for quite some time, as I've mentioned. So I wish you well, and thanks again. This is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.